about to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Jim here at GTD. Welcome to our latest A-Level Politics live stream. We've taken a half-term break and come back, and this time we're going to do our third of our core ideology session on socialism. Duncan's taken a half-term break. I've taken one, but Kira's still in the US. Whereabouts are you, Kira, at the minute?
In Oregon at the moment, just exploring the country, but I promise I'm working somewhat.
I'm sure you are. It's all right, Duncan, isn't it? Eh? Last time Santa Monica, this week Oregon. Who knows? Could be Las Vegas next time. I'll guess Las Vegas.
It could be. Maybe Choose to You will cover it.
Well, let's see how we get on with this session. So, well, a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us live. I can see from the button down here we've got lots of students joining us for the live session, and we've had hundreds of students who've caught up on catch-up on the replay versions of these sessions. So you're very welcome too if you're watching on replay. It's about 30-35 minutes or so of revision activities and exam technique advice, in this case on socialism. So, Duncan, without further ado, are you going to kick us off? Who's starting?
I will,
Is it you or Kira?
I'll make a start. Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to have a think about our key thinkers to start with, our socialism key thinkers. And we've got some dates down the left-hand side of the screen, and we've got some key thinkers down the right-hand side. They're all our named key thinkers on the specification. And we've got the dates in which they lived. And I want you to put them in the order of they were born. So obviously the first year on those lists. And let's see how you get on. So all you need to do in the chat window, if you're watching live, is to put the letter and the number where you think they're together. So, if you think A is Rosa Luxemburg, you'd put A1. you don't have to wait and do them all. If you spot some that you think you know, feel free to get that one straight down, or you can do them in order. It's entirely up to you. I think some probably easier to spot. There are a few clues in there. So, for example, one we've got one who's still with us, so that might be a one to have a look. Scene Mime has come in and suggested 1D, Rosa Luxemburg, as being 1871 to 1919. Well, I think that may well turn out to be right, and I wonder if a good clue there is, sadly, that she died in 1919, following the Spartacist uprising. Someone saying they saw Giddens speak recently, so still with us. So that may well be a clue. Clive's coming with Marx as being A, and Webb as being C. Could well be correct. Oh, Anna's coming in with a lot there. A as Marx, B as Engels, C as Webb, E as I suggested E as Giddens, maybe. Infinity's gone with E. F as Giddens, and Clive's gone with E as Crossland. I think between you may well have got them all. So shall we have a look at the solved timeline? Some excellent answers there. Well done, using your general knowledge. And Anna's put there that she knows that Marx died before Engels. Absolutely, Engels published some of Marx's work posthumously. So some really good answers there. It is useful to know. You don't necessarily need to know their exact dates, although why wouldn't, if you can learn them, why not? But it is useful to know when people came, to sort of see a kind of chronology of these key thinkers, and where they come. And some of them perhaps, wouldn't necessarily immediately think, that Beatrice Webb was born, quite a while before Rosa Luxemburg, for instance. Because obviously we sort of think about when they were born, but then also when they were writing and when their key writings were. Obviously Giddens still writing things now. But yes, as Anna's put in the chat window, it gives us an idea of how socialism has evolved and the different, strands of socialism that we'll be talking about with Kira in a second, sort of fitting them into a timeline is really quite useful. Okay, we're going to go on to the next activity. Well, in a moment, we're going to go on to the next activity. Just the key exam gold advice from Kira, first of all.
Okay, yes, I think with these ideologies questions, it's important to think about your assessment objectives. So what are the things that you need to achieve when you're writing an essay for ideologies? So for your AO1, your knowledge and understanding, the way that you can demonstrate that in your answer is to refer to key thinkers. So the activity that Duncan went through is really useful. So thinking about when they were alive and the context in which they were alive as well kind of helps you to understand that a bit better. Of course, your AO2 is incredibly important, which is your analysis. And analysis is where you're not just saying what you know, but you're turning that into something. You're putting your own view in it, in the sense that you're thinking, how do they relate to each other? How similar are the different strands? How different are the different strands? And then, of course, AO3, which is your judgment, where you have your overall opinion at the end. So if you're saying socialism is more similar than it is different, this is where you kind of justify it, which is quite important. So let's think about that then. So if socialism is split into 3 strands, let's kind of think, what are these 3 strands for socialism? So we have revolutionary, social democracy, and third wave. So what I want you guys to do in the chat is to think, okay, which of these numbers at the bottom relate to which category of socialism? So you can either put them in as you go, like if you think that one is related to revolutionary socialism, just write Rev 1 and so forth, right? And I'll give you maybe like about a minute to see how many you can kind of get through and see if you can match all of these ideas to the relevant strands.
I think there are 1 or 2 that could potentially go in more than one place, because obviously socialists do agree about certain things. So there are a couple of controversial ones.
We have some agreement, yeah.
And when the clock's finished, I'm going to say one other thing about the strands, which always occurs to me about this. So, I bet people know. I bet you know what I'm going to say. It's the usual thing. But Anna's coming with me.
So third way, nationalisation, free market, reform. Maybe there could be a contradiction there between the two of them.
Might be mixing up nationalisation and privatisation. Maybe. Shall I just quickly say what the other thing I was going to say is that it is mentioned in the specification actually, but there's a sort of a missing strand, and I always think there's this sort of missing strand which is the kind of evolutionary socialism or democratic socialism, which kind of gets tied in with social democracy, I guess, here, but is, I do feel it's a little different when we talk about, say, Beatrice Webb, for example. You do feel that that's something a little different from, say, Tony Crossland, and that kind of tradition, which at the time when the spec was written was seen as being probably quite marginal in the Labour Party. But then we had, the sort of Tony Benn type sort of democratic socialist left thing. But then obviously we had the Jeremy Corbyn era sort of thing. That bit sort of is missing in the specification in a way, kind of non-revolutionary, but left-wing socialism. But anyway, that I always sort of feel we ought to point that out because a couple of them.
I think it is important because it was kind of. I remember in the first examiner's report when we first sat the exam, which I think is the only time it was actually sat, and the examiner wrote, "Nobody needs to mention evolutionary socialism because the question didn't ask about that." So you have essentially both revolutionary and evolutionary socialism do want to overhaul capitalism and have a socialist movement, but they kind of want to achieve it through different means. So obviously for revolutionary socialism, it's about we need to overthrow through a violent revolution and dismantle the state. Whereas evolutionary socialism was maybe a bit more optimistic. They thought with the workers getting the franchise that they would vote in socialist parties and achieve socialism through the ballot box instead. Obviously, we've seen that hasn't quite worked. So, it is a weird one. It's there, but I think it's good to know it. But I think it's important that when you're writing these essays, that you're thinking about it and you think, okay, is evolutionary socialism relevant to this question? Webb's a very interesting human being, but do you need to include her in your answer, which is, it's complicated, I think.
It is. So I suppose the key point is that as far as the spec's concerned, the three strands are the ones that you've got on the screen there: revolutionary, social democracy, third way. Not all our key thinkers perfectly fit into those, and Beatrice Webb's a good example of one that doesn't. And so I think it's good to be aware that, there are perhaps socialists that don't entirely fit into those.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. We've got the solved wall.
It's good to see more answers coming through as well. And I think you're right. Anna did misread it. I think she's banging her head on the keyboard with that one. Third way is very different to the other strands. So the other strands are kind of talking about maybe the more of the limits of capitalism and this suspicion of capitalism, with revolutionary wanting to just completely abandon it, have workers take control of society through a revolution where you remove the bourgeois state, the middle class state entirely. Whereas maybe social democracy is a bit like, capitalism's fairly reliable if we ignore the Great Depression, and we can actually maybe nationalize it and readjust capitalism to work for the good of the workers through nationalizing key industries, so healthcare, schools, things like that. And then third way is like, no, capitalism is pretty good. The free market's pretty good. Us politicians have no idea what we're doing when it comes to the economy, so let the market work out itself. And instead, we're just going to counterbalance it by having things like Sure Start centres where people can get training so they can access jobs and have equal opportunities rather than equality of outcome. So, we're really good. So, interesting point from Anna there. So Clive said, could third way also be referred to as pragmatic socialism, winning elections and being able to govern? Yeah, really good point. Like, what's the point in having socialist ideas if you're just kind of preaching them on your soapbox? Is it better to preach them in Parliament and to actually make legislative change? But
I mean,
then,
obviously,
yeah, go
there's
on.
also the question you could ask: is third way socialism at all? And what's the difference between the third way and, say, modern liberalism, progressive liberalism, or something like that? That is probably a
Mm.
debate for another day. But it's an interesting question if it's about free market and equality of opportunity, but counterbalancing the ills of capitalism. That is quite similar, isn't it, to social
Mm.
liberalism, modern liberalism? I think the sort of collectivism is the sort of probably the key difference. There's a sort of communitarian element to third way
Mm.
socialism that you don't tend to get so much in modern liberalism. The one I was going to just pick up on was equality of outcome.
Yeah.
Which obviously is the best placed in revolutionary socialism, but I think some social democrats would sort of focus on that as well. Like Tony Crossland was
Mm.
quite keen on quality of outcome into with his campaign against grammar schools and things like that, as opposed to
Yeah.
yeah.
And it was in the Labour Party manifesto, not manifesto, so the Labour Party values until
Mm-hmm.
Tony Blair removed it, which goes back to that idea is third way socialism when it isn't committed to equality of outcome and instead focuses on equality of opportunity. And it is very interesting. When Margaret Thatcher said her greatest achievement was Tony Blair, I think that says a lot. Um, and it's good because what's so good about socialism as an ideology for A-level politics students is it is so split. And I think that makes there a lot more to write about, which is really good. It's just about focusing kind of what you're writing about. So in terms of like the structure of the question, what is it that they could potentially ask you? And you'll see it's the exact same as the last two sessions that we've done together. So let's have a think. So you could be asked a question on these kind of just core components of an ideology. So to what extent do socialists agree on things like human nature, the state, society, the economy? So thinking about the three different strands, there might be some, as Duncan said earlier, actually is a really strong correlation between social democracy and revolutionary. But then we see quite a departure when we look at third way socialism. And then the core principles of socialism that you could be asked specifically on would be things like social class. So we know that they disagree in terms of third way socialism, which says, let's not be reductive and just talk about class conflict. Those days are over. We're all middle class now. Whereas it is the kind of the bread and butter of revolutionary and even in some ways social democracy too. So these are the kind of core principles: workers' control, equality, and collectivism. Those are the sort of things that you could also be asked the question on. Which I find it really fun actually to just sit and think, how could I answer questions on each of these? But maybe I'm sad, but then I am a teacher, so I am sad. So if we would think about a question like, to what extent do socialists agree on human nature, for example, so one of the components, I think in terms of revision, it's good to just plan this out, kind of make yourself a table and think, okay, so what is the revolutionary perspective of human nature? So you've got key thinkers. So I always think, where would I place them? Which thinkers represent human nature really well? And both Marx and Luxemburg talk very strongly about this idea of human nature, of human beings being social beings. So human beings who thrive with cooperation, who do better when we're working together rather than competing with each other. And that's also can be said when we're looking at social democracy. So Crossland is a really good thinker for social democracy. He talks again about this idea of the merit of cooperation. So things like when workers have a stake in society, but they want to make society better because it is their human nature, so altruistic as well. And then you come to third way, and it's a little bit different. It kind of says, yes, human beings do naturally want to get along and live in a society, live in a community. But what actually motivates them isn't this idea of let me help and be altruistic. What motivates you is competition. And what we need to do, according to Giddens, is we need to try to create that competition that he believed was quite positive in the private sector and harness that towards kind of community to counterbalance the inequalities that come out from capitalism as well. So what I want you guys to do now is we're going to have a turn for you to think about it in these kind of terms before doing an on balance activity. So we'll first start off with agree. So I want you to see how many I've put 2 down, but you can put down as many as you can possibly think of. What are 2 arguments that could be used to support the view that socialists agree on the role of the state? So type what you think in the chat. How far do they agree, and what do they agree on? Or maybe even what strands agree with each other. So just give you a few seconds, 30 seconds to do that.
I guess even here, there are probably some differences even within the strands, aren't there? And kind of what was said kind of in theory, like say, for example, what Marx wrote about the state and then what revolutionary socialism did in practice would be quite different, arguably. Yeah, so that.
And Luxemburg and disagreed with, well, actually not so much Marx, but Lenin,
But
right?
Lenin,
So
yes, absolutely, yeah.
we felt that, the state should be, after you remove the bourgeois element of it, should be democratic, whereas some believe maybe it should be more authoritarian. So it is hard, isn't it, trying to split these things into three categories and do it in, 35 minutes?
Yeah.
Good luck, guys. But it's fun to think about. Okay, so any ideas about how they might agree on the role of the state? I think agree actually might be the harder one to do. So Anna's put down she's split because revolutionary socialism disagrees. Libertarian socialists, so third way, maybe, I don't want to decrease the role of the state, but Marxist-Leninists think that the state should be a vanguard, but all of road.
But with a
Brilliant.
road, yeah. So Marx said,
Yeah,
the state should wither away, didn't he? Marx said,
that's such a good point, actually. Yeah.
and
So,
Lenin talked about all power to the Soviets, which was quite an anarchist idea, although it was partly just to keep the anarchists on board for a while in the early days of the
yeah. So I think that's a good point, and it's kind of hard to think about how they agree, but you have to. So the essay requires balance. That doesn't mean that it needs to be a 50-50 split, but it does require you to at least pay tribute and think, okay, there is some agreement between them.
Pages mentioned that quite a few socialists, so social democracy and third way to some extent, and I think probably if we're going to have our evolutionary socialists in there somewhere, would agree about state intervention, that there should be more in order to she's put to create equality of opportunity, absolutely, and also potentially create equality of outcome as well. So state intervention in the economy, I think quite a lot of socialists would agree with that, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. So it's about trying to pick out some similarity. You don't need to say they wholeheartedly agree, but there is kind of some agreement. So the two that I put down, and Paige has picked up on it already as well, is this idea that, the state should intervene. The state is interventionist. So even though, as Anna rightly said, the state should wither away, before it does wither away, it is very interventionist in kind of creating the structures that are needed in order to have a stateless society. And, all of them in some way do acknowledge that the state should do this because the capitalism is not a fair economic system. But you can see I am actually reaching there. So Adesola said they agree.
It's getting into the economy, isn't it? But it does definitely link, and these things do link. So you could get a question on the economy rather than the role of the state, but you'd end up talking about quite a lot of the same things. But it's just the focus would be
exactly. And as long as you bring back the focus to the overall question, you're fine. And that's all you need to do. So it's really important. So Adesola said they agree industry should be regulated by the state. Oh, nice. I like this. In order to serve the broader public interest. And this follows their perspective on the importance of community. Well, Adesola, you can take my job. Fantastic. That's beautiful. Nice.
And then Clive mentioned state investing in infrastructure, improvement in welfare, improvement in education. So there'll be a lot of agreement on that, won't there, across quite a lot of socialists.
Yeah, and it's just about trying to pick it out, stand back a bit and look at it from afar, and then you can kind of see some thread of agreement. And then it's about how you argue that thread of agreement that really matters, how you use the thinkers and then do that analysis as well. So I think this one might be a little bit easier. What can we say about disagree? So what are two ways that socialists disagree on the role of the state? Definitely a lot more of a fun one.
We've probably touched on some of it, haven't we? So if people try and
I think we accidentally talked about it, didn't we?
into words, but it's fair enough. makes it an easier question, then, doesn't it?
Just as long as you're more focused in your answers, that's fine.
But people might come up with other ones as well as the ones that have already been mentioned.
Third way is more of a free market believer, so less state intervention. Fantastic, right? Whereas if we look at social democracy in Crossland, it is 100% about state intervention. Profits should be not given to individuals, but actually reinvested back in the community. So really, really good point. Capitalism is corrupt to Giddens, acceptance of neoliberal economy. Yeah, excellent. So, as Clive said, Marx view that there is no merit to capitalism; it is a sickness in society. Whereas Giddens said it's not that bad. Maybe we can kind of work with it. And
You also
let
get
it.
yeah. You also get the kind of public-private sort of linking together, don't you? In the third way, that so the state should work with private. With private enterprise together through public-private partnerships, and that's where all the sort of PFI and all that kind of thing came in, didn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
New Labour era.
Transport to London is a perfect example where
Mm-hmm.
it's both publicly and privately owned, and that seems to work quite well. So how the state should improve, remove entirely by revolution or reform by the ballot. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it. That's a beautiful criteria page. So thinking about, so you've got the criteria about the way that the state should be adjusted, and you're thinking about two different ways of doing that. I think that's great. And Adesola again, revolutionary socialist. Marx and Engels envisioned the state withering away as a communist society will emerge. Fantastic. So nice, building off of what Anna said. And then you got Beatrice Webb, democratic socialism. So still kind of evolutionary, about the expansion of the state. Oh, fantastic. Key terminology as well. With specialized administrators to organize, plan, and regulate the economy. Who would be middle class? That's perfect. Fantastic.
Yeah, really good.
So let's just ignore what I wrote down. But yeah.
No.
So you've got like this idea that the state for social democracy should be manage the economy. So that's the state's role in it. So again, you see, we're talking about the economy, but how the state interacts with the economy. So that's still fine. And revolutionary is, Adesola said it better. So overthrow versus expand with evolutionary. Okay, so what I'll do then is I'll talk you through kind of what does this maybe look like in practice. So as Engels said, a ton of theory is worth an ounce of practice. So let's follow what he's talking about. So when we're writing this, we talk about a lot that you have to make a judgment whilst being balanced, and it sounds like we're just really confused. But what we mean by that is you kind of, when you start your essay, you have your overall opinion about socialism. Do you think that socialists ultimately adapt their ideas in order to be, as Clive said earlier, pragmatic? There's no point being a socialist if nobody's going to vote for you, if you can't make any societal change, for example. So do they adapt their ideas in order to fit in and become actually elected or make change? Or do they just, when they change, just actually, it's not a pragmatic shift. They're actually just completely abandoning their core values and their core ideas. So if we're going to ask the question, to what extent are socialists united in their view of the economy? I would argue it's a complete abandonment. I don't know how, on one hand, you could say capitalism and the free market is the most evil asset of society, and then go, actually, it's quite good. We're going to continue using it. So I'm going to argue abandon. But as we said before, we need to kind of think, how can we argue within that and have that balance that they might adapt? So because I'm going to argue abandon, I'm going to start with abandon. That way my argument feeds through the entire essay. So if you have any questions as I'm kind of talking, feel free to write them in the chat and I can clarify anything for you. So what I would think then, okay, so we want to argue that they need to be kind of actually united in their view. Disunited in their view, because we're arguing that they abandon. So we need to first think about a criteria. So Page actually started doing that. How can we measure this similarity and difference? So we can argue, okay, in some ways they have this idea that capitalism as an economic system can be regulated. So Crossland talks about regulating capitalism. So we're using our thinker to talk about social democracy. So there can be some profits in society because of this rise of managerialism, which means that it's not the same society, or capitalism is not the same as when Marx was talking, where it was the middle classes owned everything and the working classes owned nothing. You actually have people owning stocks and shares, people being managers rather than just factory owners and so forth. And Giddens also said, yeah, that's true. Like, there is much more social mobility in society. So capitalism doesn't need to be overthrown, it just needs to be regulated. So you can talk about that there and how there's that kind of similarity from it. But actually, you would argue as well that this is a complete abandonment from what Karl Marx and Rosa Luxemburg advocated, that this idea of an equal or a fair society is not at all plausible or possible when we're looking at capitalism, because capitalism exists in order to create inequalities. So yeah, in the West as well. Thank you, Anna. Really good point. And actually, Luxemburg also said that the only reason why capitalism could survive and be as strong as it is because of imperialism, because you can have this abundance of wealth in Western countries when you're taking away from countries in the South. Good question from Clive. Would you suggest that you can answer this in a chronological sequence?
I'd be cautious. I mean, you could do, couldn't you? But when I've seen some feedback from the examiners, they've sort of cautioned against essentially just telling the story. You've got to make sure. So if it could end up being in that order, but you've got to make sure that you are, you're comparing the strands and seeking the agreement and the disagreement. Whereas if you sort of did first Marx said this and then Luxemburg said that and then Webb said that, you wouldn't kind of focus on that. Would you agree? Yeah, you wouldn't.
I agree.
Yeah. So I think it would make sense, I guess, to talk about, Marx quite early on, partly because he came first, but then you'd probably want to contrast him with, say, Giddens or Crossland rather than, so to do that, if you're making the argument that they disagree, rather than necessarily sort of telling the story chronologically. But it absolutely is important to know when they came, so that
and I think as well, it's like the ideas are important. So what we're talking about is their ideas. We're not just talking about like when they were around and things like that. So I think it's good to talk about Marx and how sometimes it is good to establish him first because his opinions are so strong and they are kind of the cornerstone of communism and early socialism. And then you can talk about what those fundamental principles are and then how they've been abandoned. Or you could actually start with Crossland and Giddens and then say, however, Marxism, it's not Marxism, but sorry, socialism at its core, if we look at the origins of the ideology, is about abolishing the bourgeois state and not trying to tinker with it. So I think it depends. For me, it's easier to rationalize it by starting with Marx, but you don't necessarily have to. Okay. So you can argue then that this idea that capitalism can be regulated is a complete abandonment because capitalism is an evil in society that needs to be abolished according to Marxism and also Luxemburg as well. So if we think about adapt then, so this is the harder bit, like how can we argue that they adapt? You could talk about Crossland and Giddens and they kind of talk about an adaptation of socialism. But when we're thinking about it in terms of Marx talking about about how can Marx and Giddens be in the same ideology, we can kind of loosely argue that capitalism leads to inequality. I think every single strand of socialism does argue that, whereas if we're looking at every strand of liberalism, or it's actually not that, it just leads to inequality, but that's ultimately a bad thing and it's unfair. So we're looking at classical and modern liberalism. Classical liberalism will argue that capitalism leads to inequality, but that's a good thing, and it should be like that because people deserve it. Whereas modern liberalism will say, nope, it is unfair, so we need to adjust it. So that's a departure, that's an abandonment. But with socialism, all three strands do argue that actually there is inequality in capitalism that needs to be addressed. But then you could argue, however, so because we're trying to keep that argument and that line of argument going, however, despite the fact that they agree that there is inequality, their theory of addressing that inequality is so different that the three strands of the ideology cannot be reconciled. So you're talking about what the thinkers argue, putting them forward, and then really linking it back to, even though I'm talking about adapt, I know that this isn't the key part of the argument and that ultimately they abandon. And that's kind of how you achieve that kind of balance in the essay. Okay.
I was just gonna say on that, because I think that's the tricky thing, isn't it? So if this paragraph is kind of basically saying that there is some agreement here that the socialists do agree on this, you kind of got this sort of judgment based on just that little bit of the paragraph that there is some agreement, but you do need, if your overall judgment is they fundamentally disagree, essentially that the modern socialists have abandoned the core principles of traditional socialists, then you need to have that extra bit, don't you? Another sentence at the end there saying, however, this is not, there's not sufficient agreement to, essentially change your overall judgment. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the top part of AO2. That's the comparative of the arguments. That's where you're comparing them and using that comparison to come to AO3, which is your overall judgment.
Yeah.
And I think Clive put it brilliantly. So exam responses, Marx, Crossland, and Giddens are the key thinkers of the key thinkers. Definitely, yeah. You definitely need to use all three of those. I think they just are the best way to kind of frame it. So remember, you're capped if you don't use two. So using those three to talk through the strands will give you a really strong essay, and anything else you do will just kind of add to that. But yeah, so if you have any questions, please add them to the chat, and maybe we're going to think about perhaps talking through an answer in future. So if you think that's something that you would like, just let us know. So on to you, Duncan, for your spelling mistakes.
Okay, so just some key socialist key terms just to finish with, where we have messed up the vowels. I will try and pronounce them, which always causes some amusement. So the words now look unrecognizable, and you've just got to say what the key term is. If you can also give us a quick definition of it, that would be brilliant. So we've got kemen unishep. Kemen unishep. What could it be? Any ideas? John's come in with common ownership. Absolutely. And Adesola as well. Yeah. Common ownership. Does sound like a Welsh rapper. Yes.
I did think he was speaking Welsh.
So we can link that to clause 4, which I think was some reference to that earlier, wasn't there? The clause 4 of the Labour Party, which used to be a commitment to common ownership. Okay. So it's to do with the economy. Okay. Fraternity. This is a key term on the spec, not fraternity, but what it should be. Yeah, we've got the correct answer. It is fraternity. It means kind of brotherhood. Absolutely. Paige has come in with the definition there. Well done. Thank you. Very good. Am I going to try and pronounce this one? Uvalotanuri Sakaulausum.
Sound like you're in Lord of the Rings or something.
It does a bit, doesn't it? I'm sort of speaking in Old Elvish or Orcish or something. Uvalotanuri Sakaulasm. I reckon we could work out what the second word is, can't we? Yeah, Paige has got it again. She's good at this. It is evolutionary socialism, which is the one thing we were talking about earlier, weren't we? It is mentioned on the spec. It's not mentioned as one of the strands, but it is in there as kind of the opposite of revolutionary socialism in terms of instead of achieving socialism by revolution, you achieve it gradually through democratic means, parliamentary means. Ruvosonism.
Sound like you need some help.
I do a little bit. Paige has asked a brilliant question there. What's the main difference between social democracy and evolutionary socialism? Now, some people would say there isn't much difference at all, but on paper, at least, the difference is that, like, say, if you take Beatrice Webb, she would argue that she wanted to replace capitalism with socialism, and so change the system from a capitalist system to a socialist system, whereas social democrats want to maintain capitalism, but to change it, to make it sort of a kind of human face of it, but not to replace it. So that's the given reason. And Paige has got the answer to this one as well: revisionism, which is really good.
I think
and
I think as well. Oh, sorry. Just to say that I think with democratic socialism, they just want to achieve the socialist revolution kind of nicely through the ballot box, whereas
yeah, yeah. So
social democracy doesn't want to change
no,
capitalism. It just wants to make capitalism more fair. So if you're a
yeah,
democratic socialist, you're advocating for the overthrow of society
mm,
through voting, and very gradually, because they believed it'd be inevitable that that you would have socialism, whereas social democracy doesn't want that.
I mean, the reason why it's not necessarily as straightforward as it might be is that both, say, for example, Tony Crossland and Tony Blair would describe themselves as democratic socialists, but obviously they have a different idea of what being a socialist is than, say, Tony Benn or even Beatrice Webb. And also the confusing aspect of it would be Tony Crossland kind of thought post-war Britain was socialist, so the kind of because it was what he thought of as socialist, so sort of a welfare state, post-war consensus for him was a sort of post-capitalist, social democratic socialist state. So it gets nicely confusing, and that's why some people use the terms reasonably interchangeably. And you might argue, is there that big a difference to what Beatrice Webb wanted than Tony Crossland wanted? And that would be one of those debates about the extent to which they disagree.
It's a big conversation.
It is. Probably too big for now, but but yeah, absolutely. And revisionism, someone like Tony Crossland would be seen as being revisionist. It's very much changing socialism. It's actually part of this what we're discussing in total, isn't it? Whether we move on from the classic traditional views. Class sensuousness. Oh, Anna's already come in with the answer before I'd even tried to pronounce it. It was class consciousness, a nice Marxist term there, referring to people understanding their being conscious of their class situation and their relationship to the means of production. Okay, fantastic. I think that might be the last one. It was. Well done. Some brilliant answers there today. Really good.
Fantastic. That last activity was a bit easier than Word Smash, Duncan.
It was a bit. Yes. But Word Smash is fun, and we will try it again.
I do like Word Smash.
Fantastic session. Kira, you made an interesting suggestion there. Certainly one we can try to plan for this term and into 2022, perhaps working through some example responses, worked answers to these classic ideology questions. I think that would be really useful. Maybe a session where we look at one or two of those would be great. So if you're watching live as well as on catch up, if you think that would be useful, please do mention that or put a comment in the comments box on the thread on YouTube. And also, I'm just thinking ahead to now that we've done the 3 core ideologies, which of the non-core ideologies we do next, the next 1 or 2. So again, it'd be useful on live chat as well as on the comment thread if you want to type into comments which of the non-core ideologies that you are studying, which one would you like us to do. What do you think, Duncan? That might be the next.
I think that would be useful, because it would be good. It would be good to look at, but obviously you're only doing one, but you might be doing a few different ones. So, if we end up doing one that you're not doing, we apologise for that, but we'll be back with something that's relevant.
Let's see if we can get them back here. Looks like we've lost them. Never mind. We've reached the end of the session. So hopefully we'll see you the next time for our next A-Level Politics live stream. So see you later.